literature. So our first speaker is Pia Napolitano de Majo. She got her bachelor's degree at the University of Naples, her master's at the University of Bologna, and she will be continuing her studies in Munich. Her title of her paper today is The Past in the Present, Homer and Margaret Atwood, a methodological proposal. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen. So thank you to our research cluster for today's opportunity. My name is Pia Napolitano de Majo. I graduated in Italy in classical philology, and I'm now approaching to the reception of classics with the PhD that I'm now starting in Munich. So in Italy in the 70s, the wording fortuna del classico, literally the text's luck, was substituted in comparative studies by the word reception from the German Rezeption. The concept of reception focuses no more on the circulation or popularity of a text. Rather, it designates the semantic contribute that the readers give to the life of the text with their expectations, knowledge, and interpretations. That is how a text enters the system of communication, when the message, in this case, the text, passes from the transmitter to a receiver, from the author to the reader. If the addressee does not receive, communication fails. The one proposed here is a sociological idea of literature that takes in higher account the social function of texts. The most influential reception theory is the one proposed by the German scholar Hans Robert Jauss. His concept of horizon of expectation claims that the sociocultural system that the text references determines objectively its horizon of expectation. We can read together here that a published work does not present itself as an absolute novelty in an empty space, but prepares its public to a specific form of reception through advertisements, obvious or hidden signals, familiar characteristics, or implicit information. The work awakens memories of what has already been read. It feeds expectation for what follows and for the conclusion. It suggests to the reader a precise emotional aptitude. This way, it preliminarily provides a general horizon for its understanding. Thus, there are different forms of reception, like acculturation, adaptation, analogy, appropriation, dialogue, hybridization, migration, reconfiguration, translation, transplantation, version. When there is an interaction between classical material and other traditions, as in classical reception, this may involve a cultural exchange in the meeting of different artistic contexts. The parameters of cultural history are constantly being redrawn. Thus, the requirement to develop transparent rationales and practices in cultural philology that will make critical inquiry a reality in the present and form a coherent basis for investigation by the cultural historians of the future. The case study for today's speech is Margaret Atwood's reception of the myth of Penelope, narrated by Homer in the Odyssey. My claim is that the classical reception acts not only when Atwood blatantly rewrites the myth in her 2005 work, The Penelopiad, but also in her famous science fiction novel, The Handmaid's Tale. I will propose here 3 questions and some guidelines to approach them. Number 1, how can we engage meaningfully with something that has already been, and what is the point of doing so at all? How do writers and readers in the 21st century both receive and respond to the so-called closed texts of the classical canon? How do classics act as a conscious and subconscious encyclopedia in contemporary authors and their texts? To answer the first question, Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad provides a retrospective vision of an Odyssey that has already happened, and by so doing, opens up an extended investigation of what it means to receive the texts and myths of the classical past. Responding to and reformulating the tale of the Odyssey after the event, Penelope's storytelling mirrors the process of reception. We can read together the first words that Penelope uses in the Penelopiad. Now that I'm dead, I know everything. This is what I wished would happen. But like so many of my wishes, it failed to come true. I know only a few factoids that I didn't know before. Death is much too high a price to pay for the satisfaction of curiosity, needless to say. Hadn't I been faithful? Hadn't I waited and waited and waited despite the temptation, almost the compulsion to do otherwise? And what did I amount to once the official version gained ground? An edifying legend, a stick used to beat other women with. Why wouldn't they be as considerate, as trustworthy, as all-suffering as I had been? But after the main events were over and things had become less legendary, I realized how many people were laughing at me behind my back, how they were jeering, making jokes about me, jokes both clean and dirty, how they were turning me into a story or into several stories, though not the kind of stories I'd prefer to hear about myself. Now that all the others have run out of air, it's my turn to do a little story making. I owe it to myself. I've had to work myself up to it. It's a low art, tale telling. Old women go in for it, strolling beggars, blind singers, maidservants, children, folks with time on their hands. To answer our second question, how do writers and readers in the 21st century both receive and respond to the so-called closed texts of the classical canon? We can say that consciously correcting the narrative of the Odyssey via the subversive counter-story of the Maids showcases a vision of reception as retelling and complicating classical texts, both by inserting a new and often subversive narrative and by amending the multiform text of the Odyssey to the correct edition. This shows that we are not only respondents to, but also, like the Maids, direct participants in the classical past. We can now read the first words of the chorus of Maids. We are the Maids, the ones you killed, the ones you failed. We dance in air, our bare feet twitched. It was not fair. And now, coming to our third question, how do classics act as a conscious and subconscious encyclopedia in contemporary authors and their texts? Margaret Atwood's words written in 2005 for Publishers Weekly in the wake of publication of the Penelopiad can help us. Strong myths never die. Sometimes they die down, but they don't die out. They double back in the dark. They re-embody themselves. They change costumes. They change key. They speak in new languages. They take on other meanings. As well, we can read also her work published in 2011 in Other Worlds, Science Fiction and Human Imagination, where she says, mythology, science fiction of the other planetary kind, and modern technology, they all do fit together. At first glimpse, mythology might seem to be the odd one out, being ancient rather than ultra-modern. But as we have seen in the cases of Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, this is very far from being the case. In fact, all the most salient features of these early comic book heroes have deep roots in literary and cultural history, and possibly in the human psyche itself. In Other Worlds is an exploration of my own lifelong relationship with literary form or forms or subforms, both as reader and as writer. The second chapter, Burning Bushes, is concerned with my undergraduate interest in ancient mythologies, which both predate and inform science fiction. For who does not know Margaret Atwood, she was born in Canada in 1939 and is still active. Since 1961, she has published 18 books of poetry, 18 novels, 11 of nonfiction, 11 books of nonfiction, obviously, 9 collections of short fiction, 8 children's books, and 2 graphic novels, and a number of small press editions of both poetry and fiction. In 1985 was published The Handmaid's Tale, a futuristic dystopian novel set in a near-future New England, in a strongly patriarchal, white supremacist, totalitarian, theonomic, theocratic state known as the Republic of Gilead, which has overthrown the United States government. The central character and narrator is a woman named Offred, one of the group known as handmaids, who are forcibly assigned to produce children for the commanders, the ruling class of men in Gilead. The pivot is that most women in Gilead have become infertile. Fertile women become handmaids, They greet each other by saying, "Blessed be the fruit." The fruit in this context is the womb. They are not to think that their reproductive organs are their own, but that they belong to Mother Nature. The women are thought of as property, much as natural things can be regarded as property. The Penelopiad is a novella published in 2005 as part of the first set of books in the Canon Gate Myth series, where contemporary authors rewrite ancient myths. In the Penelopiad, Penelope reminisces on the events of the Odyssey, life in Hades, Odysseus, Helen of Troy, and her relationship with her parents. A Greek chorus of the 12 maids who Odysseus believed were disloyal and whom Telemachus hanged interrupt Penelope's narrative to express their view on events. The maids' interludes use a new genre each time, including a jumper prime, a lament, an idyll, a ballad, a lecture, a court trial, and several types of songs. Here is a diagram which shows some salient common elements between the two works. They're both postscriptums. They were both written after the story, the history was canonized. And so they're both her stories versus his stories. So history written by men. And they both present a chorus of oppressed that this time has a voice. That is the voice of Penelope on one hand and of Fred on the other, but it's also the chorus that takes its own place in the narrative. Commenting on the Penelopiad, Emily Hauser writes, "Fiction in the female voice has taken it upon itself to use its narrative agency, its powers of voice assimilation, and the manipulation of the instability of the textual tradition and the fault lines across which reception is enacted, to explore the ambivalences and complexities of Penelope's character. And in so doing, it opens up new insights into our reading of the Odyssey." Hauser applies this reading to the Penelopiad, but we have seen how the Handmaid's Tale shares the same pitch, which can ultimately be interpreted as Margaret Atwood's way to discuss gender issues or to bring them about. We do not have the time here to open on the aspects on this specific aspect of my work, but it will now suffice to remember that in the last few days, thousands of women in America and around the world have been protesting wearing the Handmaid's Tale symbolical cloak. So again, where does this useful and relevant literature stem from? We can read Margaret Atwood's own words on this. "Ancient myths precede histories and were once thought to be histories. They were thought to be true accounts of important matters. As science fiction often shares many features of such myths, we might want to consider these important matters. Where did we kids discover the knowledge of flying capes, superpowers, other planets, and the like? In part through the primitive comic strip superheroes of the times, the most popular of which were Flash Gordon for space travel and robots, Superman and Captain Marvel for extra strength, superpowers, and cape-based flying, and Batman, who was immortal with a non-functional cape, one that must have encumbered him somewhat as he clawed his way up the sides of buildings. But who nonetheless shared with Captain Marvel and Superman a weak or fatuous second identity that acted as a disguise. Those crossed with the wonderful Wizard of Oz, a dollop of Greek mythology, and our one small book on the solar system were probably the sources of our core ideas. So to wrap up today's talk, we can argue that most contemporary literature, in particular the one we just analyzed, The Handmaid's Tale, can be more fruitfully studied using a comparative method. And yet it may also be said that comparatism is intrinsic in the act of reading. Every reader confronts the current lectures with precedent ones or with ordinary reference, as well as every text conglomerates aspects of the author's life and readings. As Virginia Woolf writes in How Should One Read a Book, we only have to compare. With those words, the true complexity of reading is admitted. As a classical philologist, I shall compare Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and the Penelopiad with its mythological background, which is explicit in the latter work and implicit but admitted, as we have seen, in the former science fiction novel. The study of myths and symbols applied to Atwood's works also allows for a better informed reading of the reception of Atwood's work. As a matter of fact, the approach in cultural studies and multiculturalism has as its foundation the idea that a text serves for the creation of an identity, whether it be racial, social, or sexual. Therefore, peculiar groups it's peculiar of groups or of an individual within a social universe organized by the relations between different communities and by the power of nations, media, and multinational companies. That is why the principal expressions of cultural studies, especially in the US, are feminist, queer, and Caribbean literatures. Moreover, the study of literature is a fundamental aspect of gender studies because it shapes roles and sexual conducts by creating paradigmatic figures, for example, that of Penelope, and by attributing specific prerogatives to women. We only have to compare is a proposal to do what has been done all day today, because classics really are relevant, both for contemporary literature's knowledge and for the public discourse. I hope I demonstrated a way in which it is possible to do so by reading Atwood's works through the classical reception lens. Thank you for your attention.